In the 3rd year of the reign of King Ahasuerus, a monarch whose shadow stretched across the vastness of 127 provinces, from the sun-scorched plains of India to the high mountains of Ethiopia, the city of Susa was transformed into a theater of unimaginable opulence. The king, desiring to display the unyielding riches of his glorious kingdom and the heavy splendor of his excellent majesty, decreed a feast that lasted for 180 days, a marathon of excess, where the princes and nobles of Persia and Media walked upon pavements of red, blue, white, and black marble. As this half-year of revelry reached its peak, a final 7-day banquet was held in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where white and violet linens were fastened with cords of fine purple to silver rings and pillars of marble, and the guests reclined on couches of gold and silver while drinking from vessels that were each unique in their craftsmanship. It was on the 7th day of this final feast, when the king's heart was merry and clouded with the vintage of his cellars, that he commanded his 7 chamberlains to bring Queen Vashti before him, wearing nothing but her royal crown, so that the assembled masses might gaze upon her beauty. However, Vashti, possessing a spirit that refused to be reduced to a mere trophy, declined the summons. This refusal was not merely a domestic dispute, but a seismic event that shook the foundations of the Persian social order, leading the king's advisors to warn him that if the queen's rebellion went unpunished, the authority of every husband in the empire would crumble. Thus, by a royal decree that could never be revoked, Vashti was banished from the king's presence, and her royal estate was left vacant, a decision that would eventually pave the way for a young orphan girl to change the course of history. In the quiet months following the king's anger, a search began for a new queen, a search that brought the most beautiful young virgins from every province into the hands of Haggai, the keeper of the women. Among these was a girl named Hadassah, known to the world as Esther, a Jewish orphan of the tribe of Benjamin who had been raised by her cousin Mordecai with the tenderness of a father. Mordecai, a man of quiet wisdom who sat daily at the king's gate, had commanded Esther to keep the secret of her lineage close to her heart, for the Jewish people lived in a delicate balance within the belly of the empire. For 12 months, Esther underwent the rigorous rituals of purification, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with sweet odors. Yet unlike the other women who clamored for the finest jewelry and silks to catch the king's eye, Esther took only what Haggai suggested, relying on a natural grace that found favor in the eyes of all who beheld her. When she finally stood before Ahasuerus in the 7th year of his reign, the king was so captivated by her spirit that he set the royal crown upon her head, making her the Queen of Persia in a ceremony marked by a great feast and the release of taxes across the land. During this time, Mordecai remained at the palace gate, where he happened to overhear 2 of the king's guards plotting to lay hands on the monarch. He quickly informed Esther, who told the king in Mordecai's name, and though the plot was foiled and the event written in the Book of the Chronicles, Mordecai was left unrewarded, his name buried in the archives of the state, while a darker power began to rise in the court. That power was Haman the Agagite, a man of immense pride, whom the king promoted above all other princes, commanding that every knee should bow before him. But Mordecai, whose soul was anchored in the laws of his God, refused to bow to a man of Haman's lineage, an act of silent defiance that filled Haman with a murderous rage that could not be quenched by the blood of one man alone. Discovering Mordecai's Jewish identity, Haman sought to destroy every Jew throughout the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus, and he cast Pur, the lot, to determine the most auspicious day for their slaughter. With the silver of a bribe and the poison of a lie, Haman convinced the king that there was a scattered and rebellious people whose laws were contrary to the state. and Ahasuerus, in a moment of catastrophic indifference, handed his signet ring to Haman, allowing him to write a decree of genocide. Fast couriers were dispatched to every corner of the empire, carrying the order that on the 13th day of the month of Adar, all Jews were to be killed and their goods taken as spoil. When the decree reached Susa, the city was perplexed, and the Jewish community was plunged into a darkness of sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai's cries reached the ears of Esther, who sat in the isolation of the palace, and he sent her a copy of the decree with a mandate. She must go to the king and plead for her people. Esther's initial response was one of terror, reminding Mordecai that to enter the king's inner court without being summoned was an automatic sentence of death unless the king extended his golden scepter, and she had not been called for 30 days. It was then that Mordecai issued his famous challenge, telling her that if she remained silent, deliverance would arise from another place, but she and her father's house would perish, asking if she had perhaps come to her royal position for such a time as this. Moved by his words and the weight of her destiny, Esther requested that all the Jews in Susa fast for her for 3 days, promising that she and her maidens would do the same. And then, with the famous words, "If I perish, I perish," she prepared to face the king. On the 3rd day, she stood in the inner court, a vision of royal dignity against the backdrop of certain death. When Ahasuerus looked up and saw his queen, the hand of providence moved his heart. He extended the golden scepter, and Esther approached to touch its tip. When asked for her request, Esther did not immediately reveal the plot, but invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. At that banquet, she invited them again to a second banquet the following day, a delay that allowed the wheels of divine irony to turn. That evening, Haman left the palace with a heart full of pride, but the sight of Mordecai at the gate sent him into a frenzy of hatred. At his wife Zeresh's suggestion, he built a gallows 75 feet high, intending to ask the king's permission the next morning to hang Mordecai upon it. However, that very night, sleep fled from the king, and in the quiet hours of the morning, he ordered the chronicles to be read to him. He heard the account of how Mordecai had saved his life and realized that no honor had been given to the man. When Haman entered the court at dawn to ask for Mordecai's life, the king instead asked him how to honor a man in whom the king delighted. Haman, believing the king spoke of him, described a ceremony of royal robes and a parade through the city, and was devastated when the king commanded him to perform that very honor for Mordecai the Jew. The humiliation of Haman was the beginning of his end. He was hurried to Esther's second banquet, where the king once again asked for her petition. This time, Esther did not hesitate. She fell at his feet and begged for her life and the lives of her people, revealing that they had been sold to be destroyed by an adversary. When the king, in a towering rage, demanded to know who would dare such a thing, Esther pointed her finger at Haman. The king stormed into the garden, and Haman, in a desperate plea for mercy, fell upon the couch where Esther was, which the king interpreted as an assault when he returned. Learning of the gallows Haman had built for Mordecai, the king ordered that Haman be hanged upon them immediately. The house of Haman was given to Esther, and Mordecai was given the king's signet ring. Yet the decree of death still hung over the provinces like a black cloud, for a Persian law once sealed could not be revoked. To solve this, a new decree was issued in the king's name, granting the Jews the right to assemble and defend themselves against any who would harm them. When the 13th of Adar arrived, the Jews, empowered by the new law and the support of the local governors, who feared Mordecai's rising power, stood their ground and were victorious over their enemies. The day that was meant to be the end of the Jewish people became the day of their greatest deliverance, a transformation of sorrow into gladness and mourning into a holiday. Mordecai recorded these events and established the festival of Purim to be observed by all generations as a time of feasting, joy, and the giving of gifts to the poor. The story ends with Mordecai becoming the second most powerful man in Persia, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed, while Queen Esther remained the enduring symbol of courage and faith, a star that shone in the darkness of an empire to save a nation from the shadows. This was the triumph of the orphan girl who became a queen, the man who refused to bow to evil, and the hidden hand of a God who works through the courage of those who risk everything for what is right.